Oh, hello there, and welcome to the Saturday streaming edition of Adam's Music Box, where today I want to remember the life, career, and legacy of Lalo Schifrin, the great composer and all around great musician who recently died. Now, because Lalo was known primarily for his extensive film works, but we'll get into his, albums, his solo albums as well. I want to focus a bit on the wider history of music in film, music at the movies. So, to start off, let's tackle the myth of the silent movie, because there actually was no such thing as a silent movie. If by that you mean people sitting in a cinema watching something being projected onto the screen with no sound present other than the chewing of popcorn and people coughing at the most inappropriate times. No, that never happened. I mean, well, no, that stuff does happen. But the part about the film being watched in comparative silence, that never happened because films always had musical accompaniments, and some of them in the so called silent era were actually very interesting. So, in the silent era, how did your average cinema work? Well, you would have either a pianist, an organist, or an orchestra. At smaller places, smaller venues, and smaller markets, it would generally be a local pianist. In the big grand downtown theaters or in some of the big ones in your luxury suburbs, you would have great big theater organs. Companies like Wurlitzer and Lowry made these huge theater organs that had so many different effects. They could sound like strings and brass instruments, and they had train whistle effects and car crash effects and all sorts of things. It was like a sampler before the sampler. These organs were truly majestic and wonderful instruments, and you can still see some of them today. At various places, a lot of theaters, not a lot, but some still have them. And there's a pizza restaurant in Mesa, Arizona, that has it as well, because there was a craze in the 70s and 80s of these old, by that time neglected in many cases, downtown theaters of selling their organs, and a lot of pizza parlors uh, uh, bought the organs. So instead of having a mechanical Chuck E. Cheese type of thing going on, you'd have a real life musician playing an organ, and it was really cool. And the only one left in the world, to my knowledge, is in Mesa, Arizona. And so you had that. And you then had some really big ones that had a full orchestra pit, just like a legitimate theater, and they had an orchestra in it. Now, what about the composition? Well, that varied. Most of the stuff was improvised on the spot or based on notes that the pianist or organist made. And occasionally, the film companies would provide certain musical cues. So you'd set a stopwatch, approximately here. When you see the train going, pull the train whistle. When something else is happening, do something else. Now, some really big films actually had a full orchestral score, which could obviously be transposed to an organ in most cases. Think Metropolis, that actually had a score. But instead of having it recorded, it would have been played live. And what goes around comes around, because now you have special events where you have, let's say, the LA Philharmonic plays Star Wars: A New Hope live. And so that is an example of what goes around comes around. But of course, what you didn't have was recorded dialogue. So you had music that was even more prominent than the music of the golden age of film composers, which is a bit ironic. Now, enter the age of the so called talking pictures with a technology called Vitaphone, because the reason that it took so comparatively long to make the pictures talk isn't because recorded sound didn't exist. Of course, it did. Recorded sound and motion picture, I mean, still film was much older, but they came relatively around the same time. It was the question of synchronizing them that proved difficult until the Vitaphone process came, which synced up large shellac discs with the projector. And a bit later, they came out with optical sound that was actually printed onto the film. That would have been in the 30s. And that was used for, your average cinema show right up until the advent of digital sound in cinema in the 90s. But of course, for big, sophisticated films, you had magnetic tapes striped onto the film beginning in the 50s. So that's where your sophisticated, good sounding film sound would go. But in any case, So the 30s and 40s produced what many still call a golden age of film composers. You had people like Bernard Herrmann, you had people like Alfred Newman, you had people like Herbert Stothart, who did, for instance, The Wizard of Oz. You had Max Steiner, probably most well known for Gone with the Wind and Casablanca. He also did King Kong, which many people say was the first film with a truly sophisticated soundtrack. Now, what do these composers have in common? Well, they were all unique, but the style in which they composed for film is probably best described as neo-romantic. So while the music scene, the art music scene, so-called modern music in the classical world was already becoming very much atonal and dissonant, the film composers generally got more inspiration from the 19th and early 20th century romantic composers, but they did incorporate a lot of modern harmonic notions, sometimes even borrowing from jazz. Bernard Herrmann, in particular, you could say was very ahead of his time, or at least very in his time, in that he wasn't totally a throwback the way others were composing in a more consciously neo romantic style. And this carried us through into the 40s, 50s, and early 60s. And it was in this era that one of the famous, let's call neo romantic composers who became most associated with film, although he did write concerti and symphonies. And this was a Hungarian guy called Miklos Rózsa. And he was wonderful. He did so many epics, probably most well known for the wonderful soundtrack to Ben Hur, which was shot in Ultra Panavision 70, 6 channels of magnetic stereo sound, surround sound, at the so-called roadshow events, which were like really nice premieres with programs and assigned seating and no people, spitting at each other in the aisles. Well, you didn't even have that among the poor in the 1950s, so go figure. But that was that. And you had the appearance around that time of another great composer who I would say was ahead of his time, even though he was quite neo-romantic. And this was Maurice Jarre, the French composer, best known for his work with David Lean, Lawrence of Arabia, Dr. Zhivago, Ryan's Daughter, even though in the later stages of his career, he did a lot of synthesized and electronic film scores. Now, the late 60s was a watershed moment in so many areas of culture. It was the era when rock and roll became the principal idiom of popular music, as opposed to jazz derived classic pop. Think Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Perry Como, Bing Crosby, etc. It was an era when filmmakers started to get with the times, because one thing that you'll notice about comparing the film and music industries, the film industry is much more conservative. Now, by that I don't mean that they're right wing. They're not, for the most part. John Wayne was, but most of them are. But what I mean by that is they're more hesitant to change formats, whether it's a style of cinematography or a style of composition that goes with the film. But by the late 60s, the film industry started to get hip. And this had several interesting developments that went along with it. One of the most interesting ones is that well-known pieces of pop and rock music and soul and R&B music, as well as original compositions in these styles for films, came to be increasingly common. The age of the big, elaborate neo-romantic score was giving way to things like Easy Rider with a Steppenwolf soundtrack, or the great so-called black exploitation films that had, Shaft, which had Isaac Hayes, or Superfly, which had Curtis Mayfield, and you had, new instruments. You had Wendy Carlos playing synthesizer versions of Beethoven on A Clockwork Orange. Now, how did we get from Miklos Rosa to Wendy Carlos and Steppenwolf in just 10 years? Well, there was someone that came in between that was able to bridge this gap while never going out of style. There's more than one person. I would say that you could put some of Henry Mancini's work into this category that was very jazzy and very contemporary. And another one I would put in this category is Lalo Schifrin, who we just just said goodbye to. Now, what did he do? He wasn't borrowing from the rock or R&B worlds, but he was composing soundtracks that were very much based on a jazz and Latin and rumba, very modern type of idiom, even certain elements of surf music, actually, which you could say was a derivative of R&B and rock and roll. And he had so many great soundtracks, but his most famous of all is, of course, Mission Impossible. Everyone knows it. It came out in the 60s in this sort of interim period between the neo-romantics and the Curtis Mayfields and the Wendy Carloses, and it took the world by storm. He did the theme from, he did TV as well, The Man from Uncle. I can just read some of the films that he's done. Where are we? So he did Bullet, wonderful film there. That was Steve McQueen. He did Cool Hand Luke. Absolutely wonderful. Cincinnati Kid, a really underrated Steve McQueen film, but really, really good. He did Kelly's Heroes, one of my favorite movies of all time, and he even wrote the music to the theme song, Broken Bridges, which I love that song. One of the best films of all time, too, if you ask me. The list goes on and on and on. And what that shows is that he was able to not just bridge the gap between these heavily orchestrated scores and the more stripped down modernism of the 70s, but he was able to sustain this throughout his life. And he was able to incorporate so many things. He could be neo romantic when he wanted to. He could be jazzy when he wanted to. He could be a bit rock and roll when he wanted to. He could be a little bit country when he wanted to. So, he's a bit of the Osmonds, I suppose. He was familiar with Brazilian music, with all sorts of Latin music, from the rumba to the samba, and of course, like I said, Brazilian bossa nova. A lot of this is probably because of his classical training in the very musically diverse Argentina of his youth before he moved out to Hollywood. And so you should check out his solo albums as well. And the one that I would begin with was one that he did on CTI Records, Creed Taylor's wonderful jazz label in the 70s, and it's called Towering Toccata. And you can hear his unvarnished compositions played by him on the piano and with a wonderful supporting cast. So you've got Joe Farrell on the flute and saxophone, such a great musician, did a lot of great records on CTI. Eric Gale, such a great guitar player. Will Lee on the bass. Yes, that Will Lee from the David Letterman show. Before that, he was a really in-demand session musician. And of course, you've got Steve Gadd on the drums. He did an album the prior year with a similar group, also on CTI, called Black Widow. I would check that one out as well. And while we're at it, why not check out all three of the albums that he did for CTI in the 70s? Including, no, it was his follow-up album, Gypsies, was actually not. It's a hell of a good album. So definitely check that one out too. Overall, though, I would say that one of the things that he was really good at doing is composing pop-ish, jazzy leitmotifs that were very memorable and singable. You can sing, you can hum along to the Mission Impossible theme, and so indelibly associated with that franchise, whether on the small screen or the big screen, that when it became a big screen event in the Tom Cruise era, in which we're still in, that same music was used and it was beloved by people everywhere. So I definitely encourage you, as we remember Lalo, to delve into his category. I would actually counterintuitively begin with some of his solo stuff, because before he got into film, he was doing a lot of Latin and Brazilian. I mean, well, Brazil is part of Latin America, but you know what I mean. Bossa Nova music, samba music, and other really interesting stuff. He was not just a great composer and conductor, but he was a really, really fine pianist all of his life. But by the mid 60s, that's when the sort of movie bug really bit him. And that became what sort of paid the bills and what he was most known for. But he did a lot of arrangements for a lot of people as well. He conducted a lot of ensembles, as music director. He even played piano for a lot of people. And it's a diverse group. He worked a lot with Dizzy Gillespie. He was the conductor and arranger on one of my favorite jazz organ albums by the quintessential jazz man of the Hammond organ, Jimmy Smith. He did both The Cat and the follow up album years later, The Cat Strikes Again. He did a lot of work with Stan Getz, who was so important in introducing Brazilian music to North American audiences. He worked with Count Basie. He did an album with the great drummer Louis Belson. He worked with Julian Cannonball Adderley. The list goes on. So he was a really in demand man for his arrangements, his compositions, his TV, his film work, and then the albums where he did it his way. You definitely should check that out. It's always sad to see a legend go, and anyone will tell you that he was an absolute legend both in his time and now. Of course, I think a lot of what he wrote will continue to live on. I mean, Mission Impossible is sort of the test case for that. That's the proof of concept, as they say. So rest in peace, Lalo. Absolutely wonderful musician who gave us the soundtrack to many of our lives. As always, like, subscribe, and we will see you next time. Take care.